Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. Today's podcast is again the next 45 pages of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's book, After the Cataclysm. As we said before, the title has been forged by the U.S. government. It is actually post-war Indochina and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology, the Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2. When the U.S. government sees something it doesn't want printed, it will forge the title and then pretend that that is acceptable behavior. So when a neurosurgeon makes a murder, makes an error and murders a patient, that it's okay to forge the data following that. Similar to that, the U.S. government forges data, for the sake of their cover-ups. It's a criminal group of white frauds. So let's continue with our discussion. Yesterday we discussed at length the different media frauds, the different media white frauds, including Henry Kamm, John Barron, Alex Paul, and Ponchaud. Henry Kamm produced an article in the New York Times. All of these people, create a situation of press fraud. They create a situation of press lies, deliberate deceit, propaganda purposes, falsifications, fabrications, omissions, and deliberate lies for the sake of propaganda. And they are, meant to, stigmatize a group of people, a regime, a government with, negativity and hate. And that is how they, justify their actions in the past. And so they built a case for, fabricating the case of Khmer Rouge being a rogue government, a government that was executing and genocide its people, as a way of saying that we were justified in going to Indochina because the communists have shown their true face as, murderers. It was all fabricated data. Henry Kamm produced no evidence. Barron and Paul produced no evidence. Ponchaud used, third-hand accounts of refugees when he was, describing the Khmer military people making statements about a genocide and lowering the population to down to 20,000. These were just refugee, everyday statements that were considered a boast by the Khmer Rouge regime and used to, cause murder of the, and were used to justify the American murder genocide in Cambodia. Once again, the U.S. government is responsible for the genocide. The sadistic, bestial butchers of the United States are responsible for the genocide. We also talk about Malcolm Caldwell, Dudman. Dudman had some, positive statements to make. He was a Marxist and, actually, Dudman was not a Marxist. Robert Dudman was with Malcolm Caldwell. In addition, Michael Parks was a Boston Globe and Baltimore Sun reporter that, basically came up with lies about the Khmer Rouge regime, the same sort of thing. All of this fraud journalism, as we said, was meant to create a state of, justification for the West. The West and the American government, in particular, were seeking to cover up their criminal, murderous war against Cambodia. And that's what they did. They used all of these, news outlets. And the criminal war and murder cover-up involved the whole of Indochina. It involved Laos, it involved Vietnam, it involved Cambodia. All three countries were subjected to the worst hate campaign and propaganda fraud by the U.S. government. White, sadistic, bestial butchers. So let's get started. We're going to give some background. As I always say, my my Google Drive link will be in the description section. Please download the Google Drive link at the Google Drive link that's listed in the description. You just cut and pasted from the browser. I recommend reading this book. It is a great book. Chomsky is very articulate and he's very good and he's not opinionated at all. He's very, very, he's a very much a linguist or a human rights advocate. He is a human rights advocate and he does things in, a very logical and consistent way. And he does not, resort to murder and fraud like the U.S. government whites that, resort to murder and fraud whenever they are, faced with stress or any kind of problem. So we're going to discuss here the racist, white, genocidal, sadistic, bestial butchers of Washington's American campaign of bombing in Cambodia and the Western colonial cover-up that occurred since. Henry Kamm, John Barron, and Alex Paul and Ponchaud were examples of fraud media by the West. Ponchaud, a Frenchman, downplayed the U.S. role in the genocide of Cambodia and the French oppressive colonial rules role in the Cambodian, murder campaign. Elizabeth Becker, Washington Post, did a fraud piece on Cambodian development reported by Western foreign correspondents of unnamed origin, possibly Asian, who was named Robert Dudman from Cambodia, who presented the character of United States journalism more than being informative on Cambodia. Malcolm Caldwell was also assassinated in Cambodia. He was also a media journalist traveling with Robert Dudman, and he was a Marxist. And there was a possible U.S. hand in this assassination because the Cambodian Khmer was not responsible, it was determined. But this has not been explored by the mafia fraud journalism of the West and the United States. Dudman wrote progress that was being placed in Cambodia by the Khmer with agrarian dike development and infrastructure. Meanwhile, Michael Parks of the Boston Globe wrote on Cambodia, quote unquote, now a slaughterhouse, stated that refugees were, all over the place, presenting the statement of Cambodia being a slaughterhouse. Third-hand accounts of refugees were being used as quotes. Fraud journalism from Baltimore Sun included fabrication of deliberate lies across American mafia journalism was used to form the basis of Michael Parks' article in the Boston Globe. The William Shawcross was a New Times press person who said that child labor printed in the New Times Journal in the United States was, very despicable. He also described deliberate lies of murder by the Khmer and child enslavement that was occurring. David Chandler reported from a 6-month stay in Cambodia and in an interview with Piang Sophie, who was an escaped refugee from Cambodia that escaped in January 1976 and went to Australia. She worked happily under revolutionary guidance, not punished for having roots in old society. Chandler was published in Commonweal, and his article was given much credence in Dr. Chomsky's analysis. Jack Anderson did a Lon Nol interview, and he was a liberal syndicated columnist of the United States and described the U.S. collapse of power that resulted in the genocide. This imperialist ideology he promoted excises the true history that he is aware of and deliberately conceals and promotes pro-colonial fascist imperialism, which was that the U.S. bombing was the cause of the mass disease, starvation, destruction of Cambodia, and the genocide, as Dr. Chomsky states in his book. The article Cambodia Silence, Subterfuge, and Surveillance was printed in Time magazine on January 8, 1979, and these lies were also reprinted in Newsweek by U.S. media deception journalism about the standard American rhetoric of the shroud of terror and darkness of the Khmer, which was seeking to counteract its worldwide image as painted by the mafia racist whites of the U.S. media as a merciless, brutal, and genocidal regime, and deliberately avoided the data presented by Dudman. Michael Vickery reported on right-wing Lon Nol premiere after March 1970 resorted to severe repression, and that the right-wing supporters of Sihanouk prior to Lon Nol were also highly repressive in the military. Lon Nol was very repressive, according to Vickery. Government forces of the colonial butcher Lon Nol, who would move into villages, kill men and women who had not already fled, and engage in individual tests of strength, which consisted of grasping infants and pulling their legs apart. These events of American intervention and brutality are a preempt to the Cambodian atrocities that the U.S. government so desperately tried to fabricate. The rightists of the Cambodian government resorted to repression and deceit. The elite wasted the country's wealth through conspicuous consumption, expensive foreign products, hard currency in banks, and frequent trips abroad. Vickery continues on the U.S. intervention and bombing, the Kissinger-Nixon policy of propaganda bombing. He bombed for the sake of future American propaganda of communist brutality that he could create through devastating violence by the machine gun government of the United States of America. Kenneth Quinn, National Security Council representative on page 251 of Chomsky's book discussed the refugees and murders and did not verify his facts, and most of his statements were unsubstantiated U.S. government rumor. We concluded with Charles Meyer of the Oslo hearings, who charged that the American Air Force caused the racist colonial genocide of the Cambodian people. See page 255 of Chomsky's book. So I'm going to read from 256 to all the way to 300, and then tomorrow will be the last day. I'm going to read continuously, so please stay, paying attention along. We learn still more about these factors in a paper by Laura Summers that's related to Meyer's, description of radicalism and excesses of the revolutionaries. We learn still about these factors in a paper by Laura Summers cited earlier. She discusses the destructive impact of French colonialism, which violated the corporate integrity of the Khmer people. Its indigenous legal system, patterns of land possession, and national administration were dismantled. During the national uprising of 1885 to 1886, French authorities, with the aid of Vietnamese infantrymen, succeeded in reducing the Khmer population of the Protectorate du Cambodge by 195,000, 20% of the entire Khmer population. The French displayed little remorse over the fate of this people, whom they believed doomed to extinction, as they brought a form of what Ponchaud calls order and peace to the land, quote unquote, to the land in fulfillment of their colonial mission, quote unquote. The impact on the countryside was particularly destructive. While most peasants owned some land, vast numbers of family holdings were insufficient for subsistence requirements by the early 1950s. Yields were among the lowest in the world and barely met the subsistence requirements of the rural population in 1965, 1966, and especially 1967. At that time, annual rates of interest for loans ranged from 100 to 200%. The total effect of credit structure in agrarian economy was to make the peasant worse than a tenant on his own property, while village and urban elites lived in luxury. Sihanouk's attempt at some social reform had little impact. Particularly scandalous was the lack of medical care and the practice of charging exorbitant fees to peasants or denying them services or hospital treatment. The judiciary was no less corrupt, and urban-based civil servants with no interest in peasant affairs enjoyed the amenities offered the rich by the colonial system, while the mass of peasants sank deeper into poverty and suffering. It is not surprising that the revolution was violent, for in addition to the human destruction heaped upon the community by intensive American bombing, there were profound social grievances and scores to be settled. In accompanying demographic analysis, Summers estimates the number of post-war deaths from exhaustion, disease, and executions in the range of 200,000, an estimate which is based on an extremely difficult to determine status quo antebellum. It is quite evident that to understand the events in the aftermath of the war, it is necessary to pay attention to the historical background of the peasant revolution, which was further inflamed and deeply embittered by the U.S. attack, culminating in the bombing of 1973, that Meyer hints might be considered genocidal in character. The sensational press accounts of atrocities that entirely ignore that background, while at the same time relying on highly dubious or sometimes fabricated evidence, may be useful contributions to the revival of imperial ideology, but they are of little value in conveying any understanding of the post-war situation. We have already mentioned the peasant rebellions in Battambang in the west and the tribal provinces of the northeast in the late 1960s. The sources of these revolts and peasant discontent, resulting from penury, oppression, and corruption under increasingly right-wing central governments, have been explored by the Australian scholar Ben Kernan. These revolts were no small affair. Sihanouk cited a figure of 10,000 deaths, a figure which he may have well exaggerated for rhetorical effect, and it is estimated that about 4,000 peasants fled their homes in June 1967 in the wake of severe army repression of their protest against the harsh local conditions as aircraft bombed and strafed villages and jungle hideouts, and villages were burned to the ground and surrounded by troops, their inhabitants massacred. By the time that Sihanouk was overthrown in the March 1970 coup, there was a sophisticated, powerful, and indigenous resistance movement well entrenched in many parts of Cambodia. After the coup, there were peasant uprisings interpreted in the West as indicating support for Sihanouk. In an analysis of the locale and character of these protests, which were brutally suppressed by military force, including Khmer troops trained by the CIA in Vietnam, Kiernan concludes that they reflect, in part, the ongoing anti-government rebellion, though loyalty to Sihanouk was no doubt a factor as well. In several studies, Kiernan suggested a picture of early post-war events in Cambodia that is rather different from what has been featured in the press. Specifically, he took issue with horror stories published in Time, April 26, 1976, which alleged that 500 to 600,000 people had died under the rule of Khmer Rouge, one of the most brutally murderous regimes in the world, which rules Cambodia by a chilling form of mindless terror, quote unquote. Like others, he notes that most of the atrocity stories come from areas of little Khmer Rouge strength, where orders to stop reprisals were disobeyed by soldiers wreaking vengeance, often drawn from the poorest sections of the peasantry. He discusses the fake photographs and gives examples of fabrication of atrocity stories by refugees in order to persuade the Thai border police to admit them. He also deals with other fabrications that have appeared in the Western press. He suggests that untrained and vengeful, and at times leaderless, some soldiers in the northwest of Cambodia have terrorized soldiers, city dwellers, and peasants. This has been aggravated by the threat of widespread starvation and actual starvation in some parts. He questions the assumption that there was central direction for atrocities, as well as the assumption that the stories from specific areas where, in fact, the Khmer Rouge had little control can be freely extrapolated to the country as a whole. His conclusions are based in part on interviews with refugees in Thai camps and in Bangkok, and like Vickery in Thailand and Fraser in Vietnam, he reports quite a range of refugee judgments on the nature of the regime. He also gives an analysis of the class background and region of the refugee flow, relating these factors to the social and economic situation that had prevailed. Kiernan's detailed conclusions suggest why attending to these questions might be useful, at least for those who concern its truth. Consider his analysis of the composition of Cambodian refugees in Thailand in August 1976. Note that this date is well after what Ponchaud describes as the worst period of terror, and that these refugees from a substantial part of the population sampled by Barron, Paul, and Ponchaud, Kiernan concludes there were 10,200 Cambodian refugees in Thailand in August 1976. A handful of these belong to that category of over half the population who, at the end of the war, had lived in Khmer Rouge areas for several years. The great majority of the refugees can be divided into three groups: former Lon Nol soldiers, former urban dwellers, and farmers for Batang Bang and Siem Reap provinces. Unsurprisingly, over a third of the 3,000 refugees in the Aranya Pradet camp in Thailand are former Lon Nol soldiers, and many of the refugees are former Khmer Serai commandos trained and financed by the CIA. In Batam Bang, Kiernan writes, the thin and undernourished Khmer Rouge troops headed directly to the airport and broke up 4 T-28 bombers into pieces, remembering the agony in the trenches, the hunger in the countryside, because the paddy fields were full of bomb craters and their terrible fear of asphyxiation bombs. For many months after that, he concludes, refugees reported that Lon Nol soldiers were hunted down, particularly northwest Cambodia. A few refugees were eyewitnesses to executions. Kiernan believes there is little evidence that the government planned and approved a systematic large-scale purge. The evidence indicates he believes that apart from the execution of high-ranking army officers and officials, the killings reported by refugees from the Northwest after April 1975 were instigated by untrained and vengeful local Khmer Rouge soldiers, despite orders on the contrary from Phnom Penh. Most of the brutality shown by local Khmer Rouge soldiers is attributable to lack of training and the difficulty of forging disciplined organization in the Cambodian countryside, especially after the bombing of the United States in 1973. Though it is also quite probable that some Khmer Rouge local cadres harbored the conception of the priorities for Cambodia's survival, with the emphasis on hard work, sacrifice, and asceticism, with which this dynamic form of Khmer nationalism entails, and which has dismayed some Cambodians, among them some cadres who ensure peasant cooperation with their policies through force. The killings were concentrated in exceptional areas where living conditions were harshest. He cites concurring judgments by Patrice de Beer of Le Monde and Ponchaud, regions where Khmer Rouge were organizationally and numerically weak. He feels that it is a little wonder that several thousand peasants have fled from northwest Cambodia, his emphasis, whereas very few peasants, if any, have fled to Thailand from other parts of Cambodia, while soldiers and former city dwellers have arrived in Thailand from eastern and central Cambodia, as well as from the northwest. The reason is that at the end of the war, farmers in the northwest were in for a very difficult period because of the drastic shortage of food, exacerbated by the flow of refugees to the towns. In contrast, in areas that had been administered by the Khmer Rouge, canals and dams had been built, enabling 2 crops to be brought in, and some rice had been stockpiled, as subject analyzed by Hildebrand and Porter, to whom he refers. Furthermore, these regions were unique in the iniquity and exploitation of the poor, with class divisions as stark as this, and after a brutal war, especially equally brutal revenge was taken by poor peasants, many of whom had joined the Khmer Rouge, though many bandits, quote unquote, passed themselves off as Khmer Rouge, as well, not an unusual phenomenon in comparable situations. He quotes one Khmer refugee who said that in Battambang, the rich were being persecuted while the poor were better off than before, and adds that where the Khmer Rouge were better organized, persecution of the rich was much less violent. This analysis covers the period of the worst terror, according to Ponchaud, the period that provides much of the basis of the best publicized accounts, Barron, Paul, Ponchaud, and reviews and references to Ponchaud. Therefore, the situation that Kiernan describes is crucially significant for an analysis of the response in the West to post-war events in Cambodia. We know of no comparable analysis from a later period, though this, in any event, would not be relevant to our major concern, the workings of the Western propaganda system. The Southeast Asian correspondent of the Far Eastern Economic Review, Nayan Chanda, presented his assessment in the situation at about the same time in several articles. In the fear, he estimated that in the 18 months of post-war bloodletting, which according to refugee reports and most observers was largely over, possibly thousands of people died, including not only the top figures of the Lon Nol regime, but also large numbers of lower strata civilian and military personnel of the former administration who have been executed in the Khmer Rouge cleansing process. But the actual numbers are impossible to calculate. The estimate of possibly thousands presumably refers to those killed, not the victims of starvation or disease or unexploded ordnance. In this May 1977 article, Chanda discusses the human cost, quote unquote, of what the regime had so far accomplished in these terms. One will probably never know exactly how many human lives have been cut down by political execution, starvation, and disease. The tendency of refugees to exaggerate their troubles to attract sympathy, the active presence of the intelligence services in the refugee camps, and the Bangkok press, the most important source of information about the massacres, and the contradictory testimony of the last foreigners present in the liberated Phnom Penh make a precise evaluation impossible. But the consistency of refugee stories in Thailand and Vietnam, and the testimony from socialist sources leaves no doubt the number of deaths has been terribly high. On the necessity for the evacuation of Phnom Penh and the question whether the executions were a result of deliberate policy or local initiative, Chanda comments that opinions vary and takes no explicit stand himself, Le Monde Diplomatique, though he suggests a point of view not unlike Kiernan's. Chanda quotes a diplomat who spent 4 years in Cambodia until the Khmer Rouge victory, and who attributes the massacres in part to the bitterness of the war and in part to the action of the have-nots against the haves. Chanda again adds that the 1970 to 1975 war was probably the most savage in Indochina, the soldiers of both sides giving no quarter, FEER. To the thirst for vengeance must probably be added the relative numerical weakness, political inexperience, and lack of organization of the Khmer Rouge, who suddenly became the rulers of a land ravaged by the war. In the absence of political work and a clandestine organization among the population controlled by Lon Nol, force more than persuasion was naturally used as the method of government. Suspicion indeed found hatred on the part of the Khmer soldiers. Young peasants, many of whom had lost their homes and families under the bombs, toward an urban population that was richer and more numerous, also seems to have played a role. Le Monde Diplomatique. Fears of sabotage was also an element. The elimination of the former regime's officials and dispersal into the countryside of the educated urban middle class has created a vertical power structure with a tiny group of French educated elite at the top dictating policy, while young and often illiterate farm boys, the grassroots cadres, are expected to implement the decisions. It is hardly surprising that these cadres rely on disciplinary action rather than persuasion or ideologic motivation. As for the post-war dead, who are listed simply as Khmer Rouge victims in the mainstream Western media, Chanda comments that disease was an extremely serious problem during the war, including 1 million suffering from malaria in 1972, and that the massive U.S. rice shipments, which were the sole sustenance of the cities swollen with refugees, did not suffice even for more than a part of the population. He cites a source close to the U.S. government who predicted 1 million deaths from starvation in Cambodia in the event of a Khmer Rouge victory, approximately the number of deaths later reported by Ponchaud, and many others on the basis of alleged estimates from U.S. government and other Western sources. Recall that these numbers, often inflated by the imaginative reporters and congressmen of the United States, are consistently attributed to the barbarism of the Khmer Rouge, who allegedly, quote-unquote, boast about these deaths. Chanda quotes one observer who says, if you consider the sheer magnitude of the problem faced by the Khmer Rouge in April 1975 and the dire prediction from Washington that 1 million Cambodians could die of starvation, this is no means achievement. He also describes the economic and development programs undertaken by the new regime at the beginning of trade and foreign contracts. The obsessive self-reliance and the conversion of the country into a labor army. His own view is evidently along the lines indicated by an observer whom he quotes. They might have read a lot of Marx, Lenin, and Mao, but the ideology of present leadership is virulent Khmer nationalism, FEER. In commenting on the contradictory testimony of the last foreigners to leave Phnom Penh, Chanda cited a letter by W.J. Sampson, an economist and statistician in Phnom Penh, who is the author of a number of technical reports on the Cambodian economy and who worked in close contact with the government's Central Statistics Office until March 1975, and was thus well placed to comment on events of the period. Both the contents and the subsequent history of this communication are interesting. Sampson cites a UN estimate that the population of Cambodia in mid-1974 was 7.9 million, which agrees with his independent estimate. He further believes that the figures offered of war casualties are much inflated, estimating civilian killings at perhaps tens of thousands. Turning to the post-war situation, Sampson finds the figure of 2.2 million dead mentioned in the press questionable. After leaving Cambodia, he writes, he visited refugee camps and kept in touch with Khmers, A European friend who cycled around Phnom Penh for many days after its fall saw and heard of no other executions beyond the shooting of some prominent politicians and the lynching of the hated bomber pilots in Phnom Penh. As far as he could determine, refugees offered no firsthand evidence of elimination of collaborators. He believes that such executions could be numbered in the hundreds or thousands rather than hundreds of thousands, though in addition there was a big death toll from sickness and there were food shortages. The communication from what seems a credible source appeared just at the time when the Baron Paul book and Lecountre's review of Ponchaud were causing a great sensation in the media about the number of 1 to 2 million Cambodians by the Khmer Rouge. The letter was specifically brought to the attention of journalists who cited Lecountre's statement that the Khmer Rouge had, quote unquote, boasted of having killed a quarter of the population, 2 million people. With one exception, they were unwilling to cite it. Porter mentioned Sampson's letter in congressional testimony when challenged by Representative Solars on his skepticism about the Famiglia Cristiana interview. Solars dismissed this by saying, "So for all you know, this fellow could be a psychotic, right? Question mark. No such question was raised about unknown priests or reporters who circulated faked photographs and interviews from such sources as Famiglia Cristiana, or who drew conclusions from interviews with prisoners in Thai police cages." Solar's question and Porter's correct response, theoretically yes, were cited by William Shawcross in a context that is even more remarkable than his willingness to cite his disreputable insinuation. Shawcross argues that both sides of the propaganda battle have failed to examine their evidence carefully. The two sides are Baron Paul condemning the new Cambodian regime and Hildebrand Porter defending it. The latter book, he writes, is in some ways a mirror image of Baron Paul. In this context, he alleges that Hildebrand and Porter's use of evidence can be seriously questioned. As his role to substantiate this charge, he offers of the fact that Porter cited the Sampson letter with its estimate of casualties as documentation in the congressional hearings when asked why he was skeptical about the charges leveled at post-war Cambodia. But Shawcross continues, Porter had to agree with Congressman Solars that Sampson could be, in theory, be a psychotic. Shawcross then reports that he spoke to Sampson by telephone to inquire into his views. He quotes Sampson as having said that altogether deaths over and above the normal death rate would not be more than 500,000. Shawcross interprets this as an estimate of the victims of the Khmer Rouge, including Mr. Sampson, thus seems an unconvinced and unconvincing witness on behalf of Khmer Rouge moderation. Neither side of the propaganda battle has carefully examined all of the sources that it wishes to exploit. Note carefully the reasoning. First, whatever Porter might have said in the May 1977 hearings, it can hardly be offered in support of the charge that Hildebrand and Porter's use of evidence can be seriously questioned, quote unquote, in their 1976 book. Worse still, as the sole support for this charge. Sampson's letter was published subsequent to the book and obviously not mentioned in it. Secondly, Sampson's letter is most definitely documentation, however one chooses to evaluate it. Furthermore, Shawcross does not question that Porter quoted it quite accurately and appropriately. As for Porter's being compelled to agree that Sampson could in theory be a psychotic, Shawcross's willingness to cite Solars' absurd question is remarkable. Porter would or should have responded in the same way if asked whether Ponchaud or Shawcross or the authors of this book, etc., might be psychotics. Quote, theoretically, yes. Furthermore, consider Shawcross's inquiry concerning Sampson's view. He argues that since Sampson has allegedly changed his mind in a telephone call subsequent to Porter's correct citation of his views, that shows that Hildebrand and Porter's book, which makes no mention of Sampson, is unscholarly and that their use of evidence can be seriously questioned. The logic is mind-boggling. But putting logic to the side, did Sampson in fact change his views, thus showing himself to be an unconvinced and unconvincing witness, quote unquote? The answer to this question depends on how we interpret the telephone statement by Sampson that Shawcross quotes. Given Sampson's known views on the general tendency to inflate figures, it might be supposed that his figures of deaths altogether above the normal is a reference to the total number of deaths throughout the war and the post-war period. In fact, in response to a query, Sampson stated quite explicitly in a letter dated March 6, 1978, that this was exactly his intent. This letter was immediately transmitted to Porter, Shawcross, and the editor of the New York Review. Aware of these facts, Porter, in response to Shawcross, wrote correctly that Sampson had intended to refer to all deaths, wartime and afterwards, when citing the 500,000 figure. Equally aware of the fact, Shawcross responded by repeating his claim that Sampson had offered the figure for deaths since the end of the war. This is surely a rather curious use of evidence, quote unquote. There is much more evidence from sources that seem to deserve a hearing but have been ignored by the media. We have noted the selectivity and choice of refugee reports. We will mention 2 additional examples of eyewitness reports that were available to the media in addition to those already cited, but that they chose to disregard. Liberation News Service New York carried a dispatch from George Hildebrand, one of the co-authors of the Hildebrand Porter study, reporting an interview with one of the few people in the U.S. today who can speak from direct experience, namely a Cambodian refugee named Khan Sikhan, who spent the better part of a year traveling through Cambodia's populous central provinces and working in a number of rural areas in the developing western region of Cambodia, after having lived both in Phnom Penh and in liberated zones in earlier years. He also witnessed the evacuation of Phnom Penh in April 1975. Sikhan saw no massacres or abandonment of sick and elderly people during the evacuation of Phnom Penh, and claims that what the Reader's Digest described as looting, quote unquote, was in fact the soldiers opening luxury shops and rice stores to the people. He states further that during the evacuation, trucks distributed rice and medicine to the people, and the people were free to join the cooperatives they passed or to move on. He lived in a commune, which he claims an 8-hour work schedule, adequate food and medical services, and generally fair treatment. His account of the revolutionary culture and the conditions of life and work in general is generally favorable, and he expresses regret that he joined a group of urban young men who escaped, saying, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I feel like I belong back there." A press concerned to determine the facts about post-war Cambodia might have chosen to explore this lead. Another example that would appear to merit attention is a lengthy and detailed account of the evacuation of Phnom Penh by Chow Mang and Shane Tar. The forced evacuations of Phnom Penh has served as proof of the near genocidal intent and practice of the Khmer Rouge ever since it was graphically reported by journalists at the time. It is featured in the books by Barron, Paul, and Ponchaud, and by many others, according to these accounts, based on refugee reports and what journalists observed largely from their confinement in the French embassy in Phnom Penh. The evacuation was a hideous atrocity. Hildebrand and Porter cite eyewitness accounts by Westerners that paint a different picture, but their book has been ignored, along with the published sources they cite. The account by the Tars, which is the only published account by participants that provides substantial detail to our knowledge, tends to collaborate the sources cited by Hildebrand Porter. Shane Tar is from New Zealand. His wife Chow Mang is Cambodian. Both joined the mass evacuations to the countryside on April 18th, returned to Phnom Penh on April 21st, and then traveled through the countryside with the convoy of journalists and others on their way to Thailand. They write that they attempted to contact the media on their return to New Zealand to present their story, but generally speaking, news editors were not interested in hearing what that we had to say unless we denounced communism in general and painted a picture of Khmer Rouge atrocities in particular, quote unquote. Several articles of theirs nevertheless appeared But apart from the left-wing press, all were heavily censored so as to make our articles appear unintelligible and contradictory, they allege. The Tars claim that people were told that they would have to leave Phnom Penh because there was insufficient food. Refugees we talked to were happy at the prospect of returning to their homes, though city dwellers were far less enthusiastic, at least those who had cut some food. The very poor were quick to leave. The initial orders were polite. Subsequently, they became more like demands than requests, though they saw no sign of force. After comparing notes with other evacuees, they conclude the force was used only on an isolated occasions. They report that prior to liberation, they had visited the hospitals and found only one calmet was functioning properly, and that the revolutionary forces continued to operate it after they took over, though most of the medical personnel had fled. They believe that patients were evacuated for more hygienic surroundings. They believe that cannot be dismissed out of hand in the light of the eyewitness account by Swain and others. They continue with a virtually hour-by-hour account of their trip to the countryside with the evacuees, then back to Phnom Penh, where they joined other foreigners at the French embassy. They report many friendly contacts with villagers, refugees, cadres, and soldiers, and they say they witnessed no executions or other atrocities and saw no attempts to intimidate people with weapons. On their return to the French embassy on April 21st, the Tars report they were questioned for several hours by journalists who had been there since the 17th of April. But when it became clear that we had no sensational stories to tell of mass executions, rape, pillage, and suicides, many of these journalists became quite disappointed. Specifically, they contend that Sidney Schamberg of the New York Times, who later won the Pulitzer Prize for his report of these days, dismissed their positive account with sarcasm. It did not enter into subsequent reports, including a long story on foreigners at the French embassy. With a few exceptions, the Tars report, for most of the time we spent in the French embassy, we were the object of abuse and fear by those who had nothing but contempt for the Cambodian people. Although Schanberg does not mention the Tars on their experience during their participation in the evacuation, Swain does refer to them. He writes that Shane Tar is so contemptible that, quote, we who have abandoned our Cambodian friends do not wish to pass the time of day with him. He is full of nauseating revolutionary rhetoric, and he and his wife fraternize with the Khmer guards over the walls. Shane Tar has a low opinion of us, members of the capitalist press, we of his hypocrisy. He is shunned. Swain also apparently has a low opinion of the experiences of the Tars during the evacuation. These are never mentioned. We will see in a moment how quote-unquote scholarship deals with the account by the Tars. The Tars then describe their evacuation to Thailand. They describe the tremendous destruction in the countryside and conversations with villagers. They claim to have seen no signs of coercion, but rather people working according to their capabilities and the needs of the group. We quote their conclusions. From our observations and understanding of the events of Kampuchea from April 17th, when we evacuated Phnom Penh to our arrival in Poi Phet on the 3rd of May, we can make this following points. We saw no organized executions, massacres, or the results of such like. We saw about 15 bodies in Phnom Penh of soldiers killed in the fighting. There was very little intimidation in Phnom Penh population by the Revolutionary Army. Many saw it not as an occupier, but as a liberator. We can refute the claims of the imperialist media that the Liberation Army indulged in a mass orgy of looting and destruction. The march to the countryside was slow and well organized. People who had no relative to stay with were put up by other villagers in the liberated areas until they were assigned elsewhere. They were provided with food. Number 5, the aged and the ill were not expected to join in the march. We saw very few who were old or sick on the road. Those that we met elsewhere told us that the revolutionary organizations catered to their needs. We saw the destruction of 5 years of war and intense U.S. bombings, but we also saw dams, irrigation canals, rice paddies, and people who, while having to struggle very hard, were proud to have liberated Cambodia from imperialism, and were now the masters of their destiny. Again, we may ask why the eyewitness reports of Chow Meng and Shane Tar does not enter the record as shaped by the selective hand of the media and mainstream scholarship, question mark. The question deserves a closer look. The account by the Tars on their evacuation in the convoy from the French embassy to Thailand is not unique. Many reporters were present and wrote extensively about this trip, but their account of their participation in the earlier evacuation from Phnom Penh is indeed unusual. As we have seen, journalists simply ignored it, though at the time, this was virtually the only direct evidence concerning what was happening beyond the view from the embassy. There is also apparently a conflict of opinion represented by the Tars on the one hand and Swain and Schanberg on the other about this situation inside the embassy where foreigners and some Cambodians were confined. The Tars are, incidentally, not alone in their view. Richard Boyle of Pacific News Service is a correspondent with considerable experience on Vietnam and an author of an important but unread book. On reaching Thailand, he filed a report from Bangkok published in the New York Guardian that did not appear in the mainstream press in the United States. To our knowledge, Boyle reports that he was asked by AP to take over their bureau and file for them, as well as the PNS, after the U.S. departure. I reported what the Cambodian staff reported to me, that the Khmer Rouge troops told Phnom Penh government soldiers that they were brothers and that they did not want to kill them. There were eyewitness accounts by Cambodian AP staffers of Khmer Rouge and Phnom Penh troops embracing on the battlefield. Yet when I filed this, it was censored by the Associated Press. After that story was killed, AP reported that the liberators burned down refugee huts 2 days before the fall of Phnom Penh. Yet the Cambodian AP staffers who visited the front all day could not confirm the reports. Boyle states that the stories of a bloodbath, as reported by other news agencies, cannot be verified, and there is every indication that the accounts are lies. He cites as an example an AP report that French women were raped and brutalized, though he asserts that French doctors and nurses never saw any rape victims. He also says that French mercenaries and Americans with CIA and DIA connections were permitted to take refuge in the embassy and to leave in safety, though they were regarded by the Khmer Rouge as war criminals. One of them, Douglas Sapper, a former Green Beret, publicly boasted that he was planning to take a Swedish submachine gun and raise the American flag at the U.S. Embassy, killing as many commies as I can. Yet he was one of the first Americans to seek refuge in the embassy and was permitted to leave, along with other journalists rumored to be working with intelligence through the Khmer Rouge. Though the Khmer Rouge knew of these threats, Schanberg refers fondly to Sapper as one of those who performed constructive roles in the embassy. Barron and Paul cite him simply as an American businessman. Boyle questions the atrocity reports and gives a positive account of the description and evacuation, adding that the French prevented fraternization with Khmer Rouge troops who wanted to visit journalists. His account of the situation in Phnom Penh and within the embassy is similar to that of the Tars. Returning to the theory of the free press, we see that there are conflicting reports of all these events. Swain and Schanberg present their view in the London Sunday Times and New York Times. The Tars and Boyle give their conflicting account in News from Kampuchea, international circulation of 500, and the left-wing New York Guardian, also with a tiny reading public. The detailed participant account by the Tars of the actual evacuation from Phnom Penh as they perceived it, which is quite unique, is not so much as mentioned in the mass media. Their reports appeared without distortion, they claim, only in a tiny left-wing journal in New Zealand. Boyle reports that AP refused to publish his stories when he had taken over their bureau. choosing instead accounts of atrocities that neither he nor French doctors or nurses nor Cambodian AP staffers could verify. But there was no censorship in the free press, such as we find in totalitarian states. We are aware of only one reference to the report by the TARs in the mainstream media in the West. It is worth reviewing as an indication of how academic scholarship deals with evidence that departs from the prevailing line. The well-known Cambodia specialist Michael Leifer reviewed Barron Paul in the Times Literary Supplement in a letter commenting on his review. Dorban Rothball noted that Leifer seems to accept somewhat uncritically the charges put forth in the book, despite serious questions about its accuracy and selective treatment of available data, questions that are quite pertinent, as we shall see. Specifically, Rothball cited eyewitness reports that question the Barron Paul account of the evacuation of Phnom Penh, including that of TARs. Leifer responded rather haughtily that by eyewitnesses, Rothball presumably means foreigners who sheltered in the compound of the French embassy. He does not confirm whether any of these so-called eyewitnesses had actual experiences of participation in the evacuation. Evidently, Leifer was unaware of the fact that the account by the TARs, published 6 months earlier, made quite explicit that they were direct participants in the evacuation prior to being sheltered in the embassy or on their return to Phnom Penh. Rothball then reported the TARs accounts correctly, quoting the conclusions just given in a letter which furthermore gave the citation to the report in News from Cambodia. In response, Leifer asked whether Rothball is aware of the fact that Tar and his wife were among those confined to the compound of the French embassy in Phnom Penh, which of course he was, though the relevant point is that prior to this, they participated in the evacuation. Leifer then cites Wayne's account of how the TARs were evacuated from the embassy, concluding that on the basis of this experience, it would seem impossible for the TARs to have compiled a report at first hand. He says that at one stage there was every prospect that Mrs. Tar would be separated from her husband because of her nationality and dispatched out of the capital on foot. But the weeping couple were smuggled on board a convoy by a French diplomat, citing Swain. Nowhere does Leifer mention the fact that the TARs participated in the evacuation on foot before they returned to Phnom Penh and the French embassy from which they were evacuated, and had published a detailed report of this experience. Leifer's first letter indicates that he was simply unaware of their account. His second letter cannot be explained on this basis. Rather, it reveals that he was simply unwilling to look into it, preferring to insinuate that their detailed story must have been invented out of the whole cloth, evidently in complete ignorance of what they had reported. At this point, he knew exactly where their account appeared, a striking example of careful and dispassionate scholarship. Rothball's response, correcting the factual record, was not published. So I'm going to just make a short comment here. So all of this information indicates that the Western media are frauds. Their scholarship is fraudulent. It is just fraudulent. The French didn't take accounts of the Cambodian people that were, honest observers. They, hid the facts, and they fabricated atrocities. It's all a, conspiratorial, colonialist, fascist group of frauds. It's a fraud group of Western imperialists and Western murderers. Continuing on, in citing Swain's contemptuous account of the TARs and the alleged circumstances of their evacuation, Leifer simply presents it as fact, never mentioning that their own account differs radically. Typically, an insulting account of the TARs reaches a mass audience, while their own version of events in which they were involved, including their participation in the evacuation and their relations to journalists, is not permitted to enter the public record. In this case, scholarship surpasses journalism in deceit. The journalists simply did not refer to the TARs' experiences while condemning them for their nauseating revolutionary rhetoric and contemptible efforts to fraternize with the Khmer Rouge. The Cambodian scholar goes a step further, pretending that their account does not exist, even when he knows precisely where it is to be found. To complete the story, To complete the story, we turn finally to the major sources of information that have reached the general public, the books by Barron, Paul, and Ponchaud. As already noted, the Barron Paul book and their earlier Reader's Digest article have reached tens of millions of readers in the United States and abroad, and are undoubtedly the major source of information for the general public. They have also been widely and generally quite favorably reviewed, and have been the subject of extensive comment apart from reviews, also to a mass audience ranging from a front-page horror story in the Wall Street Journal to an article in the TV Guide, circulation more than 19 million, by Ernest Lefebvre, a foreign policy specialist who is otherwise known for his argument before Congress that we should be more tolerant of the quote-unquote mistakes of the Chilean junta in attempting to clear away the devastation of the Allende period, and his discovery of the remarkable freedom of expression enjoyed by critics of the military regime. The book has been described as impeccably documented, and authors deserve substantial credit, however, for the exhaustiveness and meticulousness of their research. The London Economist wrote that the methods of documentation of the authors will convince any, save the most dedicated, skeptics that at least 1 million people have died since the fall of Cambodia as a direct result of the excess of the Angkalo. It may be the best book there will ever be on this subject. In the United States, the press response in editorials and commentary was also substantial and largely unquestioning. Not all the reviewers have been completely uncritical. Martin Woolcott noted that the estimates of dead are guesswork and that their sample of refugees is disproportionately drawn from middle class and northwest of the country. William Shawcross commented on their figure of dead is that of the Carter administration. Elizabeth Becker objects that they pepper their book with facile polemics, turning into a Cold War propaganda piece. A number of reviewers have remarked on their infantile discussion of Q Sampan's alleged importance and its significance, as well as their failure to refer to the U.S. role. When they speak of the murders of a gentle land, they are not referring to B-52 attacks on villages or the systematic bombing and murderous ground sweeps by the United States troops or forces organized and supplied by the United States in a land that had been largely removed from the Indochina conflict prior to the U.S. attack. But in general, their conclusions have been taken as overwhelmingly persuasive, if not definitive. That's with respect to Barron Paul book and Reader's Digest article. To evaluate the Barron Paul account in a serious way, one must first consider its credibility where verifiable. Their case is largely built, as it must be, on refugee accounts. How much faith we place in their rendition of these accounts and their conclusions they draw from the samples they present will be determined by their credibility, where what they say is subject to check. We stress again the importance of avoiding a gross but common error of reasoning, since the refugee accounts far outweigh in significance the supporting documentation. One might erroneously conclude that even if the latter collapses, the main charges remain intact. The error is transparent. It is only the independently verifiable material that gives some indication of the trustworthiness of their account of what they claim to have heard and found. We have already seen several examples of their exhaustive, meticulous, and impeccable scholarship, including their reliance on the Famiglia Christiana quote-unquote interview and their uncritical handling of edicts allegedly put forth by a Khmer commander. They are not, of course, to be faulted for the fact that their source, Ponchaud, has since modified and then silently withdrawn his quote-unquote quote. Though for the reasons we reviewed, there was ample reason for skepticism about this and other agencies that they cite, quite selectively, as we shall see, as fits their purposes. We have also mentioned their method of finding promising subjects under the guidance, quote, of time ministry officials and, quote, elected camp commanders, of critical admission as to methodology that should have at once alerted reviewers and commentators that this study is hardly to be taken too seriously. In fact, the reliance, whether naive or cynical, on the guidance of Thai authorities is typical of their research. In his preface, Barron reviews the diverse sources that all assured him that the communist conquerors of Cambodia had put virtually everybody to work, tilling the soil under deathly conditions. These quote unquote diverse sources are in toto specialists of the State and Defense Departments, the National Security Council, and 3 unnamed foreign embassies in Washington. The acknowledgement supplement those remarkably diverse sources as follows: the representatives of the Thai Ministry of the Interior, whose knowledge and advice additionally provided us with invaluable guidance; Cambodian specialists at the United States Department of State, the National Security Council, and the U.S. Army General Staff, who, quote, made available large quantities of their own data, guided us to other sources, answered innumerable questions, and favored us with authoritative criticism. And Ponchaud, who put at our disposal his immense store of knowledge about Cambodia, generously shared with us the results of his own research, saved us from errors through scholarly criticism, and on several occasions assisted Ursula Nechachi as an interpreter in the conduct of important interviews. Can one imagine a researcher limiting himself to comparable resources on the other side of the fence for a critical study of U.S. imperial violence, then to be lauded for his meticulous and exhaustive scholarship? The same concept of diverse sources, quote unquote, also sets the limits of impeccable documentation to which we return. No less remarkable than their search for promising, quote unquote, interviewees and their concept of, quote unquote, diverse sources is the short shrift they give to pre-1975 Cambodia. They explain that they have referred to events prior to April 17, 1975, only to the extent that we thought such references were necessary to an understanding of what has transpired since then. Reasonable enough until we see what they omit as unnecessary to such understanding. The U.S. role, for example, surely known to them if they read the journalistic sources they cite, and hardly a great secret to readers of the daily press, is off the agenda as irrelevant to subsequent events. Also unnecessary to the understanding of post-war Cambodia, in their view, are such minor matters as the background of the revolutionary movement in peasant society and social conflict. That a study of post-war Cambodia resting on such a historical vacuum can be regarded as an outstanding work of scholarship or even a useful study of current Cambodia is remarkable indeed. The framework that they set reveals with crystal clarity that their story, where unverifiable, is to be taken about as seriously as an account of the U.S. war in Vietnam produced by the World Peace Council. Correspondingly, it is treated as seriously by the free press at WPC studies are on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So you can see a little comment here. You can see Barron Paul's book. It's a fraud. It's American scholarship fraud. Quote unquote scholarship is American fraud. It is garbage. He says very clearly that a study of post-war Cambodia resting on a historical vacuum ignoring the U.S. role in Cambodia. And, the scholarship on a vacuum can be regarded as an outstanding work of scholarship or even a useful study of current Cambodia is remarkable indeed. They were completely fraudulent. Their statements were completely fraudulent. They were based on refugee sources, and they were scholarly garbage scholarly activity by the U.S. government the frauds of the U.S. government and their friends in their free press, their quote-unquote free press at Reader's Digest, who now produce scholarly activities. So continuing on, there is, of course, a method in the Barron Paul research methodology. It is not as stupid as it looks at first glance. If Cambodian history, internal social conflict, the nature of peasant society French colonialism and U.S. intervention are all excluded by fiat as unnecessary for the understanding of what has transpired since April 1975. Then the stage is fully set to blame everything on the evil communist leaders: revenge killings, disease, starvation, overwork, unexploded ordnance, the B-52 craters that have churned up the entire countryside, swaying everything. Given their framework, we hardly need to inquire into the details to predict the conclusions that these scholars will reach. Scholars, quote unquote, will reach. All deaths in Cambodia in the post-war period, all penury and suffering and strife, will necessarily be attributed to the sole factor that is not eliminated from consideration a priori: the Khmer Rouge leadership. And of course, that is exactly what the authors conclude. The absurdity of this procedure apparently has not been perceived by the many commentators who take this transparent propaganda exercise seriously. The methodology for estimating post-war deaths, which has so impressed the editors of the London Economist and other ideologists, is hardly more than a joke. One does not have to be a dedicated skeptic to question their basis for concluding that at least 1 million people have died since the fall of Cambodia as a direct result of the excess of Angkulu. Our emphasis, mere rationality, suffices, since all other factors were eliminated as irrelevant. What of the numbers? These are determined on the basis of such notable sources as Khu Sampan's alleged admission that roughly a million Cambodians died, and beyond that, estimates offered with no stated basis by various named and unnamed quote unquote Western observers, various guesses based on no cited evidence about the proportion of educated people massacred, other guesses about deaths from starvation and disease, and so on. But by such roots, Barron and Paul concoct their estimate that at the very minimum, more than 1,200,000 men, women, and children died in Cambodia between April 17, 1975 and June 1st, 1977, as a consequence of the action of Angkulu. The breakdown of numbers include 100,000 or more massacres and by execution, and most of the rest, roughly 1 million, from disease and starvation. The dedicated skeptic, quote unquote, might at this point raise eyebrows over the fact that 1.2 million in the figure allegedly produced by the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok, since repeated widely in the press, and the figure of 1 million deaths from disease and starvation happens to correspond to the prediction by U.S. government sources of the numbers who would starve to death after the Khmer Rouge victory, as we have seen, an estimate based on the assessment of the ravages of the war, specifically the destruction of the economy by the United States of America. Very little in the Barron Paul book is subject to possible verification. Therefore, an assessment of the credibility of their primary evidence, refugee reports, rests very largely on the accuracy of their brief historical remarks. Several reviewers have commented on the striking inadequacies of these remarks, failing to draw the obvious conclusion, however. If what can be checked turns out to be false or misleading, what are we to conclude about claims that are subject to no verification? Turning to their version of history, we find the standard cliches about this once happy country, now devastated by Khmer Rouge atrocities: the faithful, kindly believers in Theravada Buddhism, who produced annual rice surpluses in the plentiful land without overly exerting themselves; the Phnom Penh residents, who had been known for their spontaneity and gaiety and their uninhibited curiosity and friendliness, etc. Compare the accounts of peasant life, the exploitative existence of the Phnom Penh elite, and the history of violence in Cambodia mentioned earlier, which passed here without notice. Barron and Paul, unlike every serious commentator, make no effort to find out what lies behind the Khmer smile, and they do not seem intrigued by the fact that the very reporters they cite speak of the surprise of urban residents when dark-skinned country boys in traditional garb, looking like creatures from another planet, entered Phnom Penh in April 1965. Turning to the Khmer Rouge, Barron and Paul claim that there is no evidence that the communists ever enjoyed the volunteer support of more than a small minority of Cambodians in either the countryside or the cities, a standard propaganda cliche of the Vietnam War applied to the NLF, though known to be false by official experts. Rather, the Khmer Rouge programs alienated the peasantry effective so that their families fled to the cities in a mass migration, not from the U.S. bombing, but rather from Khmer Rouge cruelty. Their mute and phlegmatic soldiers include children impressed into the Revolutionary Army at age 10 or 11 when the communists had overrun their villages. On the assumption that these remarks accurately characterize the Khmer Rouge relation to the peasantry, the difficult question of how they now maintain control becomes an imponderable mystery, not to speak of their rise from a tiny movement to a substantial army under the most horrendous conditions and their success in defeating the Lan Nol army backed by the massive U.S. force. But no such problems troubling these thinkers. The Khmer Rouge succeeded by skillful propaganda, exploiting the U.S. limited incursions and the B-52 raids directed against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong sanctuaries. The Khmer Rouge, they explain, had new opportunities to escape the spreading fighting. People started swarming from the countryside into the cities, spawning economic and social problems for the Lan Nol government. The American intervention in B-52 raids, the latter continued until August 1973, enabled the communists somewhat more convincingly to depict the North Vietnamese as our teachers, the United States as the imperial aggressor, and the Lan Nol government as a lackey of imperialism. The Far Eastern Economic Review observed, quote, from being widely regarded as the dogmatic disciples of a Marxist ideology, alien to Khmer national traditions and culture, the Khmer Rouge became patriots. After their conjecture that the awful fate visited upon post-war Cambodia results from the chronic impotence of coup sampan, Barron and Paul add to the following explanation of the success of the Khmer Rouge, despite their terrorizing the countryside. But what is in doubt is not so important as what is certain. Coup sampan and a few kindred people who neither by achievement nor by ideas had ever attracted any substantial following absconded to the jungles, assumed leadership and insignificant intellectual little guerrilla force, captured control of political coalition, and through it absolute control of an entire society. Sheer magic. The, quote, impeccable documentation in this major work amidst the many published sources that explain how the Khmer Rouge were recruited by the U.S. bombardment of the civilian society, a factor that the authors would have us believe is as irrelevant to understanding of post-war Cambodian history as the actual situation in the countryside or the history of internal conflict. Apart from these historical comments, there is a possibility of independent verification of Baron Paul's evidence only in the case of occupation of Phnom Penh, when many reporters were present at first in the city itself and later confined in the French embassy. We will therefore consider perhaps the most striking claim that they put forth from this period. Barron and Paul claim that there was a major bloodbath. In Phnom Penh, they assert, some people saw summary executions. Virtually everybody saw the consequences of them in the form of corpses of men, women, and children rapidly bloating and totting in the hot sun. The bodies, sometimes grotesquely contorted in agony, yielding a nauseating, persuasive stench, and they had a transfiguring effect on hundreds of thousands of people being exiled, turning them into a silent cowed herd. Evidently, something so dramatic would be hard to miss, as one would indeed expect virtually everywhere to have seen it. Their supporting documentation falls into the two familiar categories: a list of names of Cambodians, verifiable documentation, namely, quote unquote, Sunday Times, May 8th, 1975, Mirror, London, May 9th, 1975, AP Dispatch from Bangkok, May 8th, 1975. Notice all racist Western, outlets of fraud, Western media fraud. Turning to the verifiable documentation, consider first the Sunday Times, May 8th. There is no such document. Presumably, they are referring to John Swain's report in the Sunday Times, May 11th. Assuming so, we turn to Swain's account. There is no doubt of his fury over the enormity and horror of what he describes in gory detail, but he seems to have missed the consequences of summary executions described so eloquently by Barron and Paul as he was walking through Phnom Penh or observing from the embassy. He does not report having seen any signs of summary executions. He does transmit stories he heard about killings, but by soldiers, but that is all. One of these stories is cited by Baron Paul with little embellishment as an example of a summary execution. Swain presents it as follows. A newly arrived French teacher says that at 8:30 this morning, he was on his way to the embassy when a Khmer Rouge patrol ran out of an alley and cut a line of refugees in half, splitting a family. When the parents protested, the leader raised his rifle and shot them in the chest. The second-hand report, if correct, would serve as a second-hand example of a quote-unquote summary execution under a broad interpretation of this concept, but provides no support for the far more dramatic claim that virtually everybody saw the consequences that Barron and Paul so vividly describe. Furthermore, this example does not support the major thrust of their argument that, quote, summary executions here and elsewhere were commanded from on high as part of a systematic policy of genocide, perhaps a consequence of Sampan's chronic impotence. Rather, it appears to be a case of a murderous act by soldiers of a conquering army, horrifying no doubt, but unfortunately all too common. For example, the robbery and murder committed by the U.S. troops occupying Japan, or their participation in mass murder of members of the anti-Japanese resistance in the Philippines, to take a case of where the armed forces in question and the society from which they were recruited had not suffered anything remotely like the savagery that the Khmer Rouge had endured at the hands of the United States. Actually, Swain also does discuss the matter of bloodbaths, though Barron and Paul do not refer to these remarks. Commenting on the assurances by U.S. diplomats that the revenge would be dreadful when the Khmer Rouge came, he writes, I can only say what I have heard and seen provides no proof of bloodbath, and I would question the reliability of reports of mass executions that almost from the start have circulated outside Cambodia. What has taken place, though equally horrific, is something different in kind. My overriding impression, reinforced as we journeyed through the countryside en route to the Thai border, was that the Khmer Rouge military authorities had ordered this mass execution not to punish the people, but to revolutionize their ways of thought. Many thousands will no doubt die, but whatever else, this does not constitute a deliberate campaign of terror. Rather, it points to poor organization, lack of vision, and the brutalization of the people by a long and savage war. That's Swain's article that was reproduced by Barron and Paul. In this connection, Swain has something to say about a bloodbath that escaped the attention of Barron and Paul completely. The United States has much to answer for here, not only in terms of human lives and massive material destruction, the rigidity and nastiness of the un-Cambodian-like fellows in black who run this country now, or what is left of it, are as much a product of this wholesale American bombing, which has hardened and honed their minds, as they are a product of Marx and Mao. The war damage here, as everywhere else we saw, is total. Not a bridge is standing, hardly a house. I am told most of the villagers have spent the war years living semi-permanently underground in earth bunkers to escape the bombing. Little wonder that this peasant army is proud of its achievements. The entire countryside has been churned up by American B-52 bomb craters, whole towns and villages razed. So far, I have not seen one intact pagoda. The final thoughts are also perhaps worth quoting. In the last 5 years, Cambodia has lost upwards of 500,000 people, 10% of its population, in a war fueled and waged on its soil by outside powers for their own selfish reasons. the people who run, live in, and try to reconstruct the heap of ruins they have inherited in Cambodia today deserve the world's compassion and understanding. It is their country, and it was their sacrifices. They have earned themselves the right to organize their society their own way. In brief, Barron and Paul are careful not to cite Swain for what he does actually say, though it is highly relevant to their alleged concerns. Furthermore, this source lends no support to their claim that virtually everybody saw the hideous consequences of summary execution, or that the summary executions were a matter of government policy. Perhaps we will do better with Barron and Paul's second source, Mirror, May 9th, 1975, AP Dispatch from Bangkok, May 8th, 1975. The Daily Mirror, May 9th, contains no AP Dispatch. This journal contains little international news. There is, however, a report by an unidentified Mirror reporter. Nestle admits such items as My Secret Agony by Girl's Mum and Men's Lib at the Altar. This story is based on reports by evacuees from the French embassy and refugees. The reporter does not seem to have been in Cambodia, so he could not have witnessed the scene described by Baron Paul, nor did the people he interviewed. But he does have this to say: the refugees heard reports of wholesale executions by Cambodians, but they never saw any themselves. So much for the second bit of impeccable documentation. Perhaps Barron and Paul, in the somewhat misleading citation quoted above, had in mind an AP dispatch from another source. There is, in fact, an AP dispatch from Bangkok filed by Jean-Jacques Cazal and Claude Juvenal on their arrival from the evacuation of Cambodia. They saw nothing about executions in Phnom Penh and report not a single corpse was seen along the evacuation route, however. Perhaps there are other May 8th Bangkok AP reports relevant to the Barron Paul claim quoted above, but the sources they cite plainly are not. Rather, these sources either say nothing about a bloodbath that should have been hard to miss on their account, or express skepticism about bloodbath reports. There is no shred of evidence from this documentation in support of their claim about what virtually everybody saw, or even in support of their general claim that the government was responsible for quote-unquote summary executions. We are left with the unverifiable documentation, alleged interviews with Cambodians. Other sources of Baron Paul, the other sources that Baron Paul cite in a related context also do not bear out their claims about the signs of bloodbath that virtually everybody saw. They cite Kazaw in AFP, Hong Kong, May 8, 1975, under the related heading, Transformation of Phnom Penh into a Wasteland. We have been unable to locate this report and doubt that it exists, but there is an AFP report filed by Kazaw on May 8th from Bangkok, at where he actually was. Here he says that there were rumors that 200 heads were lying in the marketplace and thousands of bodies rotting along Highway 5 leading north. But latecomers to the embassy said that nothing of the kind, such as the massacre, had taken place. Similarly, Sidney Schanberg, whom they cite under evacuation of Phnom Penh, notes unconfirmed reports of executions of senior military and civilian officials and the prospect that many will die on the march to the countryside. But none of this will apparently bear any resemblance to the mass executions that had been predicted by Westerners. He cites reports of executions, but none were eyewitness accounts. He saw bodies on the road from Phnom Penh, but says it was difficult to tell if they were people who had succumbed to the hardships of the march or simply civilian and soldiers killed in the last battles. Still another lengthy account, which Baron Paul does not cite, was given by Patrice de Beer of Le Monde. De Beer urges caution with refugee or Secret Service reports. How badly mistaken they were is only too well known. He is skeptical about the reports of executions. One instance cited is that of Odang, which we went through on April 30th, and where we saw nothing of the sword. He is also skeptical of monitored radio messages. When you recall that the day after Phnom Penh fell, a clandestine transmitter on the Thai border announced that a score of journalists had been killed by their Khmer Rouge, when in fact they were all alive. He describes an unknown world in the countryside, peaceful despite the devastation turning to the task of reconstruction. We hardly find here an impeccably documented account of how virtually everybody saw the horrendous scenes that Baron Paul described. In fact, their documentation reduces to category one unverifiable reports of alleged interviews with refugees. The fact appears to be that virtually nobody whose reports can be checked, including sources that they are clearly aware of since they cite them in related contexts, saw the scenes that they describe. The fact that their claim was undocumented was noted by Torben Redball in letters commenting on the reviews of the Baron Paul book in The Economist and the Far Eastern Economic Review. Baron and Paul have each responded. Each produces the obligatory insults, one of the world's few remaining apologists for the Cambodian communists, etc., with a touch of hysteria that stands in marked contrast to Redball's letters, which quietly point out errors in the book and express skepticism about its claims. We will not review their huffing and puffing in an effort to evade this issue, but the upshot is that the claim to which Redball referred, which we have just discussed, is not supported by the verifiable documentation that they cite. It is furthermore a fairly sensational claim, and one of the few that is subject to possible verification. Furthermore, even the secondhand story of an atrocity that they cite more or less accurately lends no support to their thesis about the summary executions, as we have seen. Perhaps this is enough to indicate that Barron and Paul's impeccable documentation and exhaustive and meticulous scholarship, which has so impressed reviewers, will not withstand scrutiny. The historical comments are worthless, and their effort to document what might have been observed reduces to the testimony of refugees, that is, unverifiable testimony. They do offer what, to the superficial reader, may appear to be, quote, documentation, but we discover on analysis that it is irrelevant or contrary to their claims where it exists. Recall that this is apparently the best that could be achieved with the ample resources of the Reader's Digest. In the case of the reporters of demonstrated integrity, reports of what refugees are alleged to have said must surely be taken seriously. In the present case, the very framework of analysis makes it clear that this is not a serious piece of work. At any point where their contribution can be evaluated, it is found seriously wanting, if not entirely absurd. People who are willing to place their trust in what Barron and Paul report, where no supporting documentation is available, essentially all the crucial cases, merely reveal that their preconceived bias overwhelms any critical judgment. Nevertheless, their work, both in the Reader's Digest, with its mass international circulation, and in the widely reviewed and much praised book, remains the major source of evidence on which the Western media and the general public have relied, a remarkable bit of evidence in support of the theory of the free press that we have been elaborating here. So you can see basically Barron and Paul's book is a worthless piece of garbage. It's a worthless piece of garbage, probably a Harvard or Yale academic work of scholarship that is completely fraudulent. The premises are fraudulent. They didn't even they didn't even answer the allegations that they were lying in the book by Redball. It is a group of frauds. Once again, the Western media and the United States media are frauds, a coalition of fraud liars and deceitful propagandists for the sake of communist tyranny. They made up lies and they, hid their own genocide and their own colonial oppression and mass murder campaign. So continuing on Ponchaud's book, we're going to talk about Ponchaud's book now. The second major source for Western audiences on post-war Indochina is a more serious work and deserves more careful study and critical analysis. Before discussing it, a word about its reception and impact is in order. In fact, it is not quite accurate to say that Ponchaud's book itself has been a major source, despite the numerous references to it. Rather, the impact of the book has been through the medium of reviews and derivative commentary, primarily a very influential review by Jean Lecoutre, who has compiled an outstanding record as a historian and an analysis of contemporary affairs in Vietnam and the Middle East, apart from other important work. The English translation of Lecoutre's French review appeared shortly after, months It appeared shortly after the Barron Paul Reader's Digest article, followed within a few months by their book and his corrections. The already quite extensive press commentary on Cambodia, which had been denouncing the Cambodian horror chamber and gulag since the war's end, reached a crescendo of outrage and indignation at this time, always coupled with an organized plea to break the silence that could barely be heard above the din of protest. The congressional hearings of May and July followed immediately. This escalation of the already high level of protest was caused, no doubt, by this 1-2 punch: Baron Paul for the masses in the Reader's Digest, and Lecoutre for the intellectual elite in the New York Review of Books. To appreciate how unusual all this is, compare the reaction to benign and constructive bloodbaths, as in the case of East Timor. As we have already mentioned, it is rare, indeed unprecedented, for a French book on Indochina to receive such a rapid and wide notice in the English-speaking world. Lecoutre's book on post-war Vietnam was neither translated nor, to our knowledge, ever mentioned in the press, though it was an eyewitness account based on long demonstrated expertise. In contrast, his version of a report by a hitherto unknown French priest concerning a country with which Lecoutre had considerably less familiarity became a major literary and political event. Similarly, earlier French studies that give much insight into the developments have led to the present situation in Cambodia have never been translated and were mentioned far from the mainstream. And post-war French publications that give a more positive view of the Khmer Rouge are unnoticed and untranslated. It would be difficult to argue that Ponchaud's book has been translated and so widely discussed because of its unique excellence as a work of scholarship or interpretation. Whatever its merits, one would hardly maintain that it is in a class by itself in this regard. Nor is the reason for its uncommon fame that it records horrible atrocities. The same was surely true of the work of Pamonti, Thian, and Meyer, for example, who dealt with the U.S. war. Nor can the reason, the humanitarian concern, since the latter books were far more relevant than Ponchaud's, all questions of merit aside, on any moral scale, for reasons that are simple and obvious. The information that they conveyed could lead to direct action that would impede or halt ongoing atrocities, while it is difficult to see what Westerners could do to improve the lot of those who were subjected to repression or worse in Cambodia, as specialists have commonly observed. To speak out about Cambodian atrocities in the West, joining the chorus of protest, is easy enough, as easy it would be for a Russian intellectual to condemn the atrocity acts of U.S. imperialism. It cannot be that some moral imperative affords Ponchaud's book its unique fame. In fact, it is clear enough why this study has been singled out for special attention. Its message, accurate or not, happens to conform perfectly to the needs of current Western ideology. These comments are no criticism of the book, of course. Rather, they relate to its remarkable reception and thus are relevant to our primary concern, the workings of the Western propaganda system. Ponchaud's book appeared in France in January Ponchaud's book appeared in France in January 1977. A review by Jean Lecoutre in Nouvelle Observateur was immediately translated and appeared in the March 31 issue of the New York Review of Books, probably a record for speed in reviewing a French book. Lecoutre's view had a considerable impact. Ponchaud himself writes that it provoked considerable reaction in all circles concerned about Asia and the future of socialism. Our own interpretation of the impact would be a little different. Most of those who reacted to Lecoutre's review in the media by lauding the contribution of the book that they had never seen had shown little concern for the future of socialism or for Asia, except in the sense that a fox is concerned with a brood of chickens. Others have also commented on the influence of Lecountre's review, which has indeed been unprecedented. William Shawcross writes that it had enormous impact, particularly because it was written by a former supporter of the Khmer Rouge. He has issued a mea culpa for a paper which had consistently opposed the war. It was taken up by dozens of papers. In its review, the London Economist wrote that Ponchaud's book gained considerable notoriety because of an extraordinary review in the New York Times review of books written by Jean Lecoultre, a French journalist. Lecoultre's corrections, quote, a bizarre episode, added a bit illogically to the controversy that was already well advanced over whether the book itself was adequately researched and the refugees' evidence viewed with sufficient skepticism. These comments bring about several interesting themes, which, as we have seen, crop up constantly in discussions about post-war Indochina. Consider the Economist's reference to the controversy that was already advanced over Ponchaud's book. There was no controversy. It was quite impossible for there to have been a controversy at the time when Lecoultre's review appeared. The book itself had just appeared. For all we know, there was not a single person in the English-speaking countries who had read the book, let alone engaged in controversy over it at that time, and precious few afterwards, when the unread book was having its enormous impact on the press. Nor was there any controversy, quote-unquote, well advanced in France a few weeks after publication. Furthermore, there has been very little controversy over the book since. Reviews have been consistently favorable, our own review in The Nation included, as Ponchaud remarks in the author's note to the American translation, though we raise several questions about it. But it is, as we have seen, a staple of media coverage in post-war Cambodia to pretend that a major intellectual battle is in progress, comparable perhaps to the debate over Stalinist crimes years ago. Such pretense provides a useful backdrop to the incessant plea that the story is quote-unquote untold. Everyone remains silent, etc. A performance that would have an air of low comedy were it not for the seriousness of the subject. Shawcross's observation that part of the impact of the review was due to Lecoultre's former support for the Khmer Rouge and the fact that the New York Review had consistently opposed the war is very much to the point, but the matter deserves a closer look. In fact, much has also been made of Ponchaud's early sympathy for the Khmer Rouge as evidence that his criticism has unusual force. Lecoultre does describe himself as someone who supported the Khmer Rouge cause and advocated the cause of the Khmer Rouge in their struggle against the corrupt colonial regime. His previous writings indicate, however, that he was a supporter of Sihanouk, who was a bitter enemy of the Khmer Rouge until they joined forces against colonial in 1970, and whose subsequent relations with the Khmer Rouge are not at all clear. In fact, it is difficult to see how a Westerner could have supported the cause of the Khmer Rouge, since virtually nothing was known about it. One should be aware of the that failed, quote-unquote, technique. It is a common error, as we have pointed out several times, to interpret opposition to U.S. intervention and aggression as support for the programs of its victims, a useful device for state propagandists, but one that often has no basis in fact. As for the New York Times review, it is true that enough that it consistently opposed the war and was at one time open to writers connected with the peace movement and the U.S. left, along with a wide range of others, but it rejoined the liberal consensus in these respects years ago. It may be that the impact of Lecoultre's review derived in part from the fact that it appeared in the issue immediately following the Andre Galinas article on Vietnam that we discussed in Chapter 4. This, too, was influential, and its impact was enhanced, as we have seen, but the pretense that the journal in which it appeared had been an organ of celebration for the communists, a typical lie of the propaganda institutions. Finally, as concerns Ponchaud, it is quite true that he writes that he listened to Khmer Rouge proposals with a sympathetic ear, since I come of peasant stock myself, quote unquote. As far as we know, however, during the years Ponchaud lived in Cambodia, he never publicly expressed this sympathy, and also apparently felt that no purpose would be served by any public comment or protest over the war, specifically the foreign attack, While it was in progress, we are aware of nothing that he wrote on the war, apart from several articles and his book, all after the war's end. Furthermore, he describes nothing that he did that might have been to the benefit of the peasants of Cambodia. It apparently has not been noticed by many commentators who have cited Ponchaud's alleged sympathy with the Khmer peasants and the revolutionary forces that, if authentic, it is a remarkable self-condemnation. What are we to think of a person who is quite capable of reaching an international audience, at least with atrocity stories, and who could see with his own eyes what was happening to the Khmer peasants subjected to daily massacre as the war ground on, but kept totally silent at a time when a voice of protest might have helped or mitigate their torture? It would be more charitable to assume that Ponchaud is simply not telling the truth when he speaks of his sympathy for the Khmer peasants and for the revolution, having added these touches for the benefit of a gullible Western audience or for the benefit of apologists who can then write that the atrocity stories have impressed even those such as Francois Ponchaud, who was sympathetic to the communists when they first took over. In short, neither Lecoutre nor Ponchaud nor the New York Review had ever, to our knowledge, identified with the Khmer Rouge or their quote-unquote cause. While it is true that the impact of Lecoutre's review of Ponchaud's book in the New York Review derives in part from such loose associations as those just mentioned, that is more a commentary on the media than on the facts. Lecoutre's review has indeed been extremely influential. The corrections, in significant contrast, have been little noted. Two samples from the national press illustrate the media response. Basing themselves on a review of a book that they had never seen by an unknown author, the editors of the Christian Science Monitor published an editorial stating that, quote, the loss of life had been reported to be as high as 2 million people out of 7.8 million people total. They quote Lecoutre's rhetorical question, what Oriental despots or medieval inquisitors ever boasted of having eliminated in a single year 1/4 of their own population, question mark, quote unquote. Surely enough time had passed to enable the Monitor editors to do what several private individuals had done upon reading Lecoutre's review, namely to check his source for this remark and find that it did not exist. The Monitor also cites the fake photographs discussed above. The fakery had been publicly exposed a year earlier. They quote Lecoutre's conclusion that let me repeat this again. The Monitor also cited the fake photographs discussed above. The fakery had been publicly exposed years earlier, noting merely that they have not been positively verified. They quoted Lecoutre's conclusion that Cambodia's leaders have been systematically massacring, isolating, and starving city and village populations whose crimes was to have been born when they were, never troubling here or elsewhere to inquire into the evidence for this allegation or to ask what curious aberration might impel Cambodian leaders to systematically starve and massacre the population of the country, or how a small group of leaders might be able to achieve this strange purpose. They conclude that for the outside world to countenance such barbarism and remain officially silent about it, in a sense, diminishes respect for humanity and its rights everywhere. To fully appreciate their reaction, one would have to review the shabby editorial record of this journal in countenancing the barbarism of the United States over many years. Lecoutre, like Ponchaud, takes note of the brutality of the U.S. war, surely a factor in what followed. These references disappear from the Monitor editorial, which, like Barron Paul, pretends that the current suffering in Cambodia takes place in a historical vacuum, a mere result of communist savagery. We have already quoted their earlier editorial based on Barron Paul, which avoids any reference to U.S. responsibility, though there is much moralizing about those who are allegedly indifferent to Khmer Rouge terrorism against the engaging people of Cambodia. To mention a second attempt, the liberal columnist of the New York Times, Anthony Lewis, devoted a column to Lecoutre's review. Lewis was an outspoken and effective critic of the U.S. war from 1969 and has since explained that by 1969 it was clear to most of the world and most Americans that the intervention had been a disastrous mistake, not a crime. He commented on the quote unquote painful honesty of Lecouter's article, which lends ghastly conviction to its terrible conclusions. He then quotes Lecouter's conclusion: the new rulers have invented something original, auto-genocide, a new and more horrible form of genocide. After Auschwitz and the Gulag, we might have thought this century had produced the ultimate horror, but we are now seeing the suicide of a people in the name of a revolution, worse, in the name of socialism. Apparently, a greater horror than Auschwitz or the Gulag, not to speak of the Indonesian massacre of 1965 to 1966, or the U.S. massacres in Indochina. But then, as Lewis has explained, these were only disastrous mistakes. Lewis also quotes approvingly Lecouter's claims that the group of modern intellectuals formed by Western thought, primarily Marxist thought, are systematically massacring and starving the population, and his further claim that these monsters boast of having eliminated some 2 million people, along with other citations that happen to be inaccurate. As distinct from the Monitor, Lewis cites Lecouter's reference to the U.S. role, and like his colleague warns that to remain silent in the face of barbarism as enormous as Cambodia would be to compromise our own humanity, as if there had been silence, as if it is our own humanity, quote unquote, that is at stake, as if we do not compromise our own humanity by describing American decisions on Indochina as blundering efforts to do good, quote unquote, after having remained silent about them apart from timid queries during the period of the worst barbarism. In today's world, he concludes, we ignore mass murder anywhere at our own peril. That's New York Times liberal columnist Anthony Lewis devoting a column to Lecouter's review of Ponchaud's book. The allegation that Lewis quotes are severe indeed. As a legal scholar, he might have trouble to inquire into the source of the allegations that he is reporting from a book he had never seen by an author of whom he knows nothing before broadcasting them to such a mass audience. Had he done so, he would have quickly discovered that his specific citations had no basis in the text of the book, as we shall see. And for all his expressed concern about compromising our own humanity, it is only, quote, our own peril that concerns this moralist who concedes that there is not much hope of affecting the Cambodian government, not the consequences for third world peoples who are potential victims of the hysteria that he is helping to inflame with his unexamined charges based on misquotations and errors. The Monitor was unwilling to print corrections of the false statements in its editorial or the conclusions based on them. Despite the evidence provided to them that established the falsity beyond question, they did, however, publish prominently a letter correcting some of these errors. Retraction would have been an honorable step. After Lecouter's corrections had appeared, Lewis, who had also had a hand for several weeks in the documentary evidence showing that his quotes were baseless, noted that at the end of the column, his corrections were only partial, and he did not make clear that full corrections eliminate entirely the evidentiary basis for the conclusions he proclaimed, nor did he indicate whether this fact bears on ghastly conviction lent to Lecouter's quote-unquote terrible conclusions. Since the media heavily relied on the contents of Lecouter's review, regardless of the correction, it is important to see exactly what kind of information they are offering to the reading public. We are not concerned here with Lecouter's interpretation of what he read, but rather with the evidence that was available to the many journalists who made use of this evidence without troubling to investigate its character and accuracy. Such evidence plainly consists of Lecouter's more or less explicit reference to the book. These references turn out to be false or highly misleading in every instance. Hence, the journalists were writing on the basis of no serious evidence whatsoever. Furthermore, subsequent inquiry has revealed that some of the material in the book that was the basis of Lecouter's distorted account was quite dubious at best. Again, a pattern that we have noticed earlier. Evidence about Cambodia has a way of crumbling when one begins to look at it closely, a fact that should raise some questions about the examples that have not been investigated because of their lesser prominence in the international campaign. What reached the public was a series of reports by journalists of Lecoutr's misreading of statements by Ponchaud that are themselves questionable in some instances, even forgetting the additional link in the chain of transmission, namely the refugee reports. It is therefore of some interest to review these cases one by one. The review contains the following references that can be related to something that appears in the book itself. 1. What Oriental despot or medieval inquisitors ever boasted of having eliminated in a single year 1/4 of their own population? 2. Ponchaud quotes from texts distributed in Phnom Penh itself, inciting local officials to cut down, to gash, to suppress the corrupt elites and carriers of germs, and not only the guilty, but their offspring until the last one. The strategy of Harad, Lecoutr's emphasis. 3. Ponchaud cites telling articles from the government newspaper, the Prachabat, which denounced the re-education methods of the Vietnamese as too slow. The Khmer method has no need of numerous personnel. We overturn the basket and with all of the fruit it contained. From now on, we shall choose only the fruit that suit us perfectly. The Vietnamese have since removed only the rotten fruit, and the causes them to lose time, Lecoutr's emphasis. Perhaps Beria would have not dared to say this openly. Himmler might have done so. And it is in such company that one must place this revolution as it imposes a return to the land of the pre-Anglo period by methods worthy of Nazi Gauleiters. 4. When men who talk of Marxism are able to say, as one quoted by Ponchaud, as Ponchaud does, that only 1.5 or 2 million young Cambodians out of 6 million will be enough to rebuild a pure society, one can no longer speak of barbarism, but only madness. These quotes exhaust the alleged evidence available to the journalists on whom this review had such a powerful impact and provide the basis for their further commentary. Let us now review the status of the evidence. We have already discussed the case 4, noting that the source, if any, is so unreliable that Ponchaud deleted the reference from the American edition. Case 1 is simply false, as Lecoutre points out in his corrections. There was no Khmer Rouge boast reported, and no figure of 1/4 of the population eliminated, or even an allegation of that number of post-war deaths. Turning to case 2, as Lecoutre acknowledges in his corrections, the source is not text or distributed in Phnom Penh, but something much more vague. This is true not only of the single case he discusses in the corrections, namely the injunction to suppress their offspring until the last one, but also of the others cited. The one case that Lecoutre discusses in his corrections is presented, as he says, as a leitmotif de justification in the French text. The other examples we are unable to locate in Ponchaud's French text. Those similar quotes are offered as slogans used both on radio and at meetings. What their status may be is not made clear. The radio reports are not identified. Others are elsewhere in the book, so they are perhaps refugee memories. Plainly, this must be true. The slogans reported. Thus, what we have is memories transmitted at second hand by Ponchaud, modified by Lecoutre, and presented in text, distributed in Phnom Penh. One example that Lecoutre corrects, which expresses the strategy of Harad, quotes, does this judgment still hold if it is a leitmotif without explicit source rather than an official text, ? Without pursuing that question, we note that the American translation of Ponchaud's book softens the reference still further. There is no quote given at all. Rather, the text reads, the theme that the family line must be annihilated down to the last survivor is recurrent in such reports. The relevant reports are identified only as several accounts, presumably refugee memories. Ponchaud's paraphrase of a theme that several refugees have allegedly reported does not seem to us to provide very powerful support for denunciations of a regime as employing the strategy of Harad. So we are left with only one single bit of evidence, namely case 3. This case turns out to be rather interesting. In his corrections, Lecoutre acknowledges that the Prachahat is not a Cambodian government newspaper, but rather a Thai newspaper, a considerable difference which suffices to undermine the comment that he appends to this quote. In the corrections, he writes that the Thai paper, in its issue of June 10, 1976, carried an interview with a Khmer Rouge official who said, as Ponchaud writes, that he found the revolutionary method of Vietnamese very slow, requiring a lot of time to separate the good people from the counter-revolutionaries. It was that the Thai reporters, he adds, who drew the conclusions, he quoted that the Khmers had overturned the basket. So that's where we're going to stop. We're going to stop on page 300. I'm going to go through some review. So we were talking basically about Laura Summers, basically who discussed the destructive impact of French colonialism, which violated the corporate integrity of the Khmer people. Its indigenous legal system, pattern of land possession, and national administration were dismantled. During the national uprising of 1885 to 1886, French authorities, with the aid of Vietnamese infantrymen, succeeded in reducing the Khmer population of the protectorate des Cambodge by 195,000. The French displayed little remorse over the fate of this people, whom they believed doomed to extinction, as they brought a form of what Ponchaud calls order and peace, quote unquote, to the land of fulfillment of their, quote, colonial mission. The impact on the countryside was particularly destructive. While most peasants owned some land, vast numbers of family holdings were insufficient for subsistence requirements by the early 1950s. Yields were among the lowest in the world and barely met the subsistence requirements of the rural population in 1965, 1966, and especially 1967. At that time, annual rates of interest for loans ranged from 100 to 200%. The total effect of the credit structure in agrarian economy was to make peasants worse than a tenant on his own property, while village and urban elites lived in luxury. Sihanouk's attempts at some social reform had little impact. Particularly scandalous was the lack of medical care and the practice of charging exorbitant fees to peasants or denying them services or hospital treatment, as done by the French colonial oppressors. The judiciary was no less corrupt. The French judiciary was no less corrupt. And urban-based civil servants with no interest in peasant affairs enjoyed the amenities offered the rich by the colonial system, while the mass of peasants sank deeper into poverty and suffering. Quote, "It is not surprising that the revolution was violent, for in addition to the human destruction heaped upon the community by intensive American bombing, there were profound social grievances and scores to be settled." In an accompanying demographic analysis, Summers estimates that the number of post-war deaths from exhaustion, disease, and execution in the range of 200,000, an estimate which is based on an extremely difficult to determine status quo antebellum. So it is quite evident to understand the events in the aftermath of the war. It is necessary to pay attention to the historical background of the peasant revolution, which was further inflamed and deeply embittered by the U.S. attack, culminating in the bombing of 1973 that Meyer hints might be considered genocidal in character. The sensational press accounts of atrocities that entirely ignore that background, while at the same time relying on highly dubious and sometimes fabricated evidence, may be useful contributions to the revival of imperial ideology, but they are of little value in conveying any understanding of the post-war situation. So you can see the U.S. government, who was responsible for the genocide. We said previously that Meyer believes the U.S. government is responsible for the genocide. The U.S. Air Force is responsible for the genocide. And you can make all press accounts that you want, sensational and fabricational press accounts that you want. But ultimately, the bottom line is that, it is the U.S. government butchers, the sadistic, bestial butchers of the United States government that were responsible for this genocide. The press, basically just covers up the genocide, makes, sensational press accounts, and it's all highly dubious and, fabricated evidence, falsifications, fabrications, omissions, and deliberate lies. Continuing on, we talk now about Kiernan's analysis. Kiernan's detailed conclusions suggest why attending to the questions of, basically the post-war events in Cambodia might be useful, at least for those whose concern is truth. Consider his analysis of the composition of Cambodian refugees in Thailand in August 1976. Note that this date is well after what Ponchaud describes as the worst period of terror, and that these refugees form a substantial part of the population sampled by Barron, Paul, and Ponchaud. Kiernan concludes there were 10,200 Cambodian refugees in Thailand in August 1976. A handful of these belonged to a category that over half the population who, at the end of the war, had lived in Khmer Rouge areas for several years. The great majority of the refugees can be divided into three groups: former Lon Nol soldiers, former urban dwellers, and farmers from Battambang and Siem Reap provinces. Unsurprisingly, over a third of the 3,000 refugees in the Aranya Pratet camp in Thailand are former Lon Nol soldiers, and the many refugees are former commissary commandos trained and financed by the CIA. In Batam Bank, Kiernan writes, the thin and undernourished Khmer Rouge troops headed directly to the airport and broke up 4 T-28 bombers into pieces, remembering the agency in the trenches, the hunger in the countryside, because the paddy fields were full of bomb craters and their terrible fear of asphyxiation bombs. So again, the vomiting bombs of the U.S. government, the racist warmonger butchers, the racist bestial sadistic butchers of the Washington government. For many months after that, he continues, refugees reported that Lon Nol soldiers were hunted down, particularly in northeast West Cambodia. A few refugees were eyewitness to executions. So basically, we're continuing on. So we talked basically the analysis of, Kiernan covers the period of post-war of the worst terror, according to Ponchaud, the period that provides much of the basis for the best publicist accounts, Barron, Paul, Ponchaud, and reviews and references to Ponchaud. Therefore, the situation that Kiernan describes is crucially significant for an analysis of the response in the West to post-war events in Cambodia. We know of no comparable analysis from a later period, though this, in any event, would not be relevant to our major concern, the workings of the Western propaganda system. So we are talking about the Western propaganda system. So give me a second. I'm going to just take a 1-minute break. I just need to, stretch my legs. I'll be back in 1 minute, and then we'll finish in just a few minutes. We have only a couple more references to, review. You're glad you could join us. Okay, so continuing on, the Southeast Asia correspondent of the Far Eastern Economic Review, Nyan Chanda, presented his assessment of the situation at about the same time in several articles. In Fury, estimated that in the 18 months of post-war bloodletting, which according to refugee reports and most observers was largely over, possibly thousands of people died, including not only the top figures of the Lon Nol regime, but also a large number of lower strata civilian and military personnel of the former administration who have been executed in the Khmer Rouge's cleansing process. But the actual numbers are, quote, impossible to calculate. The estimate of possibly thousands presumably refers to those killed, not victims of starvation or disease or unexploded ordnance of U.S. bombs. In May 1977 article, Chanda discussed the human cost of what the regime had so far accomplished in these terms. Basically, so he says that maybe the systematic policy was not felt to be, the reason for the executions. He felt that, again, it was a post-war situation of a war ravaged by the U.S. government, racist bombing campaign in Cambodia, and its sadistic, bestial butchers of the United States government. It's, bestial butchers and savages of Washington that did this, bombing campaign. So as far as the post-war dead, who are listed simply as Khmer Rouge victims in the mainstream Western media, Chanda comments that disease was an extremely serious problem during the war, including 1 million suffering from malaria in 1972, and that the massive U.S. rice shipments, which were the sole sustenance of the city swollen with refugees, did not suffice even for the more than a part of the population. He cites a source close to the U.S. government who predicted 1 million deaths from starvation in Cambodia in the event of a Khmer Rouge victory, approximately the number of deaths later reported by Ponchaud and many others on the basis of alleged estimates from U.S. government and other Western sources. Recall that these numbers, often inflated by imaginative reporters and congressmen, racist American congressmen, are consistently attributed to the barbarism of the Khmer Rouge, who allegedly, quote unquote, boast about these deaths, which, as we have seen, is a fraud. That boast is a fraud. That whole argument of a boast that the Khmer Rouge did was a fraud. So there was also another communication, actually. Uh, Nyan Chanda's communication, the communication from which we seem a credible source, appeared just at the time that the Baron Paul book and Lecountre's review of Ponchaud were causing a great sensation in the media about the murder of 1 to 2 million Cambodians by the Khmer Rouge. There was a letter that was sent, dated by W.J. Sampson, the Sampson letter, an economist and statistician in Phnom Penh, who is the author of a number of technical reports on Cambodian economy, had worked in close contact with the government's Central Statistics Office until March 1975, and thus was well placed to comment on events of the period. But the concerns of the subsequent history and of this communication and interest are interesting. Sampson cites a UN estimate that the population of Cambodia in mid-1974 was 7.9 million, which agrees with his independent estimate. He further believes that the figures offered of war casualties are much inflated, estimating civilian killings as perhaps in the tens of thousands. Turning to post-war situation, Sampson finds the figure of 2.2 million dead mentioned in the press questionable. After leaving Cambodia, he writes, he visited a refugee camp and kept in touch with Khmers, a European friend who cycled around Phnom Penh for many days after its fall, saw and heard of no other executions beyond the shooting of some prominent politicians and the lynching of the hated bomber pilots in Phnom Penh. As far as he could determine, refugees offered no first-hand evidence of elimination of collaborators. He believed that such executions could be numbered in the hundreds of thousands rather than in the hundreds or thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands, though in addition there was a big death toll from sickness and there were very food shortages. So, continuing on, the communication from what seems a credible source, Sampson's letter, appeared just at the time that the Baron Paul book and Lecountre's review of Ponchaud were causing great sensation in the media about the murder of 1 to 2 million Cambodians by the Khmer Rouge. The letter was specifically brought to the attention of journalists who cited Lecountre's statement and that the Khmer Rouge had, quote, boasted to have killed a quarter of the population, 2 million people. With one exception, they were unwilling to cite it. Porter mentioned Sampson's letter in a congressional testimony, when challenged by Representative Solars on his skepticism about the Famiglia Cristiana interview. Solars dismissed this by saying, so for all you know, the fellow could have been psychotic, right? No such question was raised about the unknown priests or reporters who circulated fake photographs and interviews from sources as Famiglia Cristiana, or who drew conclusions from interviews with prisoners in Thai police cages. So you can see the U.S. government, the congressional, racist fraud, Solars, Representative Solars of the U.S. Congress, is accusing psychosis in a letter that was written, in honesty and from a scholarly economist. The U.S. government are frauds. They're the psychopathic, insane butchers, racist butchers of the U.S. government, and it's congressional fraud. It's like a mafia group of, white, sadistic, bestial butchers. Their bestiality in Cambodia was definitely evident. So continuing on, there was another TARS claim. The TARS claim that the people who were told that they would have to leave Phnom Penh because there was insufficient food. Refugees we talked to were happy at the prospect of returning to their homes. Those city dwellers were far less enthusiastic. At least those who had some food, the very poor were quick to leave. The initial orders were polite. Subsequently, they became more like demands than requests, though they saw no sign of force. After comparing notes with other evacuees, they conclude that the force was used only on isolated occasions. They report that prior to liberation, they had visited the hospitals and found that only one CalMet was functioning properly, and that the revolutionary forces continued to operate it after they took over, though most of the medical personnel had fled. They believe that patients were evacuated to more hygienic surroundings, a belief that cannot be dismissed out of hand in the light of the eyewitness account by Swain and others. They continue with virtually hour-by-hour account of their trip to the countryside with the evacuees, then back to Phnom Penh, where they joined their foreigners at the foreign embassy. They report that many friendly contacts with villagers, refugees, cadres, and soldiers, and say they witnessed no executions or other atrocities, and so no attempts to intimidate people with weapons. So you can see the U.S. government journalism ignored Chow Meng and Shane Tarr's description of the lengthy and detailed account of the evacuation of Phnom Penh, deliberately ignored it because it didn't fit their Western propaganda fraud. They're fraud, liar, deliberate liars and falsifiers. couldn't fit this, this description, this lengthy and detailed account by, observers, refugee observers, Chow Meng and Shane Tar. They ignored it and basically said they never saw any genocidal intent. Nothing that, books of Barron, Paul, and Ponchaud were truthful, and, all the authors were lying. On their return to the French embassy on April 21st, the Tar report, they were questioned for several hours by journalists who had been there since the 17th of April. But when it became clear that we had no sensational stories to tell of mass executions, rape, pillage, and suicides, many of these journalists became quite disappointed. Specifically, they contend that Cindy Shanberg of the New York Times, another Pulitzer Prize-winning fraud for his report of these days, dismissed their positive account with sarcasm. It did not enter his subsequent reports, including a long story of May 9, 1975 on foreigners at the French embassy. With a few exceptions, the TAR's report, for most of the time we spent on the French embassy, we were the object of abuse and fear by those who had nothing but contempt for the people of Cambodia. So, the Western frauds, their frauds are, just contemptuous, hateful, racist, pro-colonialist butchers. They all band together by colonial fascists and, cause mass murder and extermination in, the Southeast Asian people and the third world peoples. They're third world haters and enslavers. The U.S. and France did an excellent, international gangster action in this, vicious campaign against Cambodia. So, So the final summary of this was that we saw no organized executions, massacres, or the results of such like. We saw about 15 bodies of Phnom Penh, of soldiers killed in the fighting. There was very little intimidation of Phnom Penh's population by the Revolutionary Army. Many saw it as not an occupator, but a liberating force. We can refute the claims of the imperialist media that the Liberation Army indulged in a mass orgy of looting and destruction. The march to the countryside was slow and well organized. People who had no relatives to stay with were put up by other villagers in the liberated areas until they were assigned elsewhere. They were provided with food, and the aged and the ill were not expected to join in the march. We saw very few who were old or sick on the road. Those that we met elsewhere were told us that the revolutionary organization catered to their needs. We saw the destruction of 5 years of war and intense U.S. bombings, but we also saw dams, irrigation canals, rice paddies, and people who, while having to struggle very hard, were proud to have liberated Cambodia from imperialism and were now the masters of their destiny. Again, we may ask why the eyewitness report of Chow Meng and Shane Tar does not enter the record as shaped by the selective hand of the media and mainstream scholarship, ? I can say why. Because the white frauds of the scholarship, the U.S. scholarship, are fraudulent scholars. They are fraudulent liars, deliberate propagators of propaganda and pro-American garbage fraud and pro-Western colonialist and imperialism fraud. So that's completes that segment, and then finally, we talked about Baron Paul's book. Basically, the Baron Paul book. Baron Paul's book, Reader's Digest article. This was a scholarly article. This is a scholarly book, a scholarly fraudulent book. To evaluate the Baron Paul account in a serious way, one must first consider its credibility where verifiable. Their case is largely built, as it must be, on refugee accounts. How much place we faith on their rendition of these accounts and the conclusions they draw from the samples they present will be determined by their credibility, where they say is subject to check. We stress again the importance of avoiding a gross but common error of reasoning, since refugee accounts far outweigh in significance the supporting documentation. White may erroneously conclude that even if the latter collapses, the main charges remain intact. The error is transparent. It is only then independently verifiable material that gives some indication of the trustworthiness of their account or what they claim to have heard and found. So we're going to give you the summary of what he believes Baron Paul's book says. So I'll basically this impeccably documented book. Uh, So, this impeccably documented book, perhaps this is enough to indicate that Barron and Paul's impeccable documentation and exhaustive and meticulous scholarship, which has so impressed Western reviewers, will not withstand scrutiny. The historical comments are worthless, and their effort to document what might have been observed reduces to the testimony of refugees. That is unverifiable testimony. They do offer what to the superficial reader may appear to be documentation, quote unquote, but we discover on analysis that it is irrelevant or contrary to their claims where it exists. Recall that this is apparently the best that could be achieved with the ample resources of the Reader's Digest. In the case of reporters of demonstrated integrity, reports of what refugees are alleged to have said must surely be taken seriously. In the present case, the very framework of analysis makes it clear that this is not a serious piece of work. At any point when their contribution can be evaluated, it is found seriously wanting, if not entirely absurd. People who are willing to place their trust in what Barron and Paul report, where no supporting documentation is available, essentially all the crucial cases, merely reveal that their preconceived bias overwhelms any critical judgment. Nevertheless, their work, both in the Reader's Digest with its mass international circulation and in this widely reviewed and much praised book, remains the major source of evidence on the Western media and the general public have relied, a remarkable bit of evidence in support of the theory of the free press that we have been elaborating here. So basically, Barron's Paul book is a fraud, and the U.S. press and its media relied on this, garbage source of scholarship, quote unquote scholarship. You might as well have read Snow White in Cambodia and said that the U.S. government were, nice. They said, mirror, mirror on the wall, please make Cambodia good. And what they did is, produce craters, mass starvation, mass genocide, and then left and said, mirror, mirror on the wall. Who's responsible? The Khmer Rouge, the racist whites of the United States government. Fiction in their scholarship, racist fiction of the white frauds of the U.S. government. And, finally, the allegations that Lewis quotes. We talked about Lewis, Anthony Lewis of LeCoultre's Review. We went through his discussion of, the honesty of LeCoultre's articles. The allegation that Lewis quotes are severe indeed. As a legal scholar, he might have been troubled to inquire into the source of the allegation that he is reporting from a book he had never seen by an author, LeCoultre, of whom he knows nothing, before broadcasting them in such a manner to a mass audience. Had he done so, Ponchaud's book he's discussing. Had he done so, he would have quickly discovered that his specific citations had no basis in the text of the book, as we shall see. And for all his expressed concern about compromising our own humanity, it is our own peril that concerns this moralist who concedes that there is not much hope of affecting the Cambodian government, not the consequences for third world peoples who are potential victims of the hysteria that he is helping to inflame with his unexamined charges based on misquotations and errors. Again, a propaganda source used to confine the Cambodian regime of communism to the doldrums of, murder. And it is a racist group of whites in Washington, propagandists, genocidal butchers, who need to be removed from, world bodies. They're the recipients of Hollywood racist Oscar awards for their humanitarian issues when they are mass murderers and sadistic bestial butchers. So again, finished up Noam Chomsky After the Cataclysm with Edward Herman. The title is nicely put and concealed in the front. Post-war Indochina and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology, The Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2. 2 hours and 20 minutes. Sorry, went a little longer because I wanted to at least, mention the Western colonialism in the middle. Otherwise, that's forgotten. And then, the book is just, read. So Henry Kamm, John Barron, and Alex Paul and Ponchaud were examples of fraud media by the West. Ponchaud downplayed the U.S. role in genocide and the French oppressive colonial rule. Elizabeth Becker-Washington posted a fraud piece on Cambodian development reported by Western correspondents of unnamed origin, possibly an Asian. Robert Dudman from Cambodia presents the character of U.S. journalism more than being informative on Cambodia. Malcolm Caldwell, who was assassinated in Cambodia, also a media journalist traveling with Robert Dudman and a Marxist. There was possible U.S. hand in the assassination, though not explored by the mafia fraud journalism of the West and United States. Dudman wrote Progress in Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge with agrarian dike development and infrastructure. Michael Parps, a fraudulent Boston Globe reporter, wrote on Cambodia, now a slaughterhouse, quote unquote, states refugees and fabrication reprints of deliberate lies across the American mafia journalism that were third-hand accounts of refugees rather than testimony of military leaders. William Shawcross, New Times, child labor printed in the New Times Journal of the United States. His journalism was deliberate lies of murder and child enslavement by Khmer Rouge. David Chandler reported from his 6-month time in Cambodia, an interview with Piang Sophie, who escaped Cambodia in January 1976 and went to Australia. She worked happily under revolutionary guidance, not punished for having roots in old society. Chandler was published in Commonweal. Jack Anderson did a Null interview, liberal syndicated columnist of the U.S. that stated that U.S. power collapse resulted in the genocide. This imperialist ideology he promoted excises the true history that he is aware of and deliberately conceals and promotes pro-colonial fascist imperialism when U.S. bombing was the cause of the mass starvation, disease, destruction, and Cambodian genocide, as Dr. Chomsky states. Cambodia's silence and subterfuge and surveillance printed in Time magazine lies were also reproduced in Newsweek U.S. media deception journalism about the standard American rhetoric of shroud of terror and darkness of the Khmer Rouge, which was seeking to counteract its worldwide image as painted by the mafia, racist whites of the U.S. media as a merciless, brutal, and genocidal regime, and deliberately avoided the data presented by Buckman. So, and then finally, with Charles Meyer, we reviewed his genocide by the U.S. government, his statement that genocide. So tomorrow, please join me for the last 45 pages. Noam Chomsky, after the cataclysm, Chris Meyer with the Ire Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.